All right, diving in today, we're tackling Jean-Paul Sartre,
Oh, yeah. Sure.
a
Yeah.
giant in 20th century thought.
Absolutely.
And from what you've sent over, it looks like we're going deep on his ideas about consciousness, how he became like the voice of existentialism, and some of the cornerstones of his whole philosophy, right?
Yeah.
So our mission today is to really unpack this statement. The whole world is outside consciousness.
Okay.
And figure out what that even means coming from Sartre, and then, what the implications are of his existentialist views for you, for me, for everyone listening.
Right. It all starts with that initial concept. That's crucial.
Okay, so what's the starting point here?
Well, the sources you've got really drive home that his statement, consciousness is the complete emptiness because the whole world is outside it. It's not just some random thought. It's like the foundation of everything he builds on. We've got to dig into what he's picturing with this complete emptiness, and why it was such a big deal for him.
Okay, emptiness sounds, kind of like a riddle, right?
Yeah.
But looking at the material, it does seem like there's a reason he came to this idea. It's almost like he's saying consciousness is pointing outwards, always at the world around us. Not like it's a box full of thoughts and ideas.
Right.
More like this pure state of just being aware.
Of things outside of it.
Exactly, external to it. And that feels so different from how we normally, naturally think about consciousness, right?
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. When you're on your phone, just scrolling, taking in all this stuff from, the outside world, right?
Right.
Is your consciousness this blank slate shaped only by what it comes across, not by something inside?
Almost like a mirror.
Yeah, reflecting the world.
Reflecting, exactly.
Yeah.
You see, traditional philosophy kind of went inward, to understand consciousness, like opening up a box to see what's in it.
Very true.
But Sartre, he was all about phenomenology.
Phenomenology.
And phenomenology flips the script entirely. For Sartre, consciousness isn't a thing in itself. It's a relationship with the world. It's the act of being aware of something other. So it's empty in the sense that it doesn't have stuff already in it. It's filled by the stuff it becomes conscious of. Like imagine a table. It just is.
Right.
No awareness, no choices. That's what he'd call being in itself.
You being in itself.
No, you're being for itself. You're conscious of that table. You decide, sit at it, write on it, whatever. Your consciousness is aimed at the table.
But isn't the table itself?
Exactly.
Now, it's pretty wild how popular Sartre was when he was alive, like a philosophical rock star.
Sure.
And the material seems to suggest it wasn't just his ideas, but his image, like a revolutionary. And of course, being the main guy for existentialism. And he really did show up at a specific time, a moment when the world was ready for him.
You hit the nail on the head. The sources point to a few things happening at once.
Right.
First, existentialism. Its core ideas, they really resonated after the war.
After WWII.
Yeah. The world was messed up. People were looking for meaning. Existentialism said, individual freedom, that's what matters in a meaningless world.
Makes sense.
Second, his whole anti-establishment vibe.
Yeah.
That fit perfectly with the 60s, right? Che Guevara, student protest, all that.
It all lined up.
It was a potent mix, a philosophy for a disillusioned generation, and a guy who was like, screw the rules.
So here's the kicker.
What's that?
The sources also mentioned that a lot of his political predictions were flat out wrong, which is kind of funny for such a brilliant mind.
Yeah, it is interesting. Shows that philosophical genius doesn't guarantee seeing the future of politics, I guess.
Right. He had these deep insights into being human, but maybe not so much into how politics really works.
Yeah, he was super engaged with the issues, but the real world didn't always play out the way he thought it would.
So existentialism with Sartre at the helm, it became this huge thing.
It did.
One of the sources quotes Juliet Greco saying, "You become what you do."
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, right. It really captures the whole philosophy of action idea. But then there's this other view that existentialism was just a bunch of navel-gazing, solipsism almost. Like, only your own mind is real.
That's the tension at the heart of it, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, you become what you do.
Yeah.
That's powerful. No destiny. You shape your own life. That's the action part. But then all this focus on individual freedom, it made some people think it was too inward-looking, isolating.
Right.
And the material points out how it went hand in hand with rejecting bourgeois values, all those conventional middle-class ideas. Existentialism was against all that.
So to understand Sartre, we've got to go back to his early life. The material digs into some really interesting stuff there, like his dad dying when he was just a year old.
Wow.
And Sartre later said that actually saved him from being crushed. That's a pretty heavy statement.
Heavy indeed. To see his dad's death as like a liberation, that tells us a lot about how he saw himself. His resistance to, well, to father figures, he felt it let him escape those societal pressures.
Right.
You know, the expectations. He even talked about not having a superego, rejecting the whole obedience thing.
But, and this is what's fascinating, the sources point out how this kind of clashes with his anti-bourgeois views later on, and his lifelong fight against authority.
Yeah, it's almost like a paradox. No superego, but always rebelling against something.
Exactly.
And then there's his grandfather, Karl Schweitzer.
Right.
Sartre describes him as this big patriarchal figure, like God the Father, even though he claimed he didn't have that superego. So clearly, there was some authority figure in his life, even if it wasn't his dad.
It's complicated, isn't it? Like, he rejects the idea of a father, but still has this powerful figure in his life.
It goes to show that self-analysis can be messy. He might have rejected the role of the father intellectually, but his grandfather was there. A real presence and authority, no matter how much Sartre tried to downplay it.
And then there's his relationship with his mother, Anne-Marie.
Yeah.
The sister-mother dynamic. The material suggests that it was super important for him his whole life, more like friends than a traditional mother and son.
Yeah, they were incredibly close, especially after moving back in with the grandfather. This sister-mother thing, it kind of breaks down the usual family roles. And maybe that closeness filled the gap left by his dad. He seemed to always need that deep connection.
It's also kind of amazing that Sartre was calling himself a genius as a kid.
Really?
Yeah, and apparently nobody argued with him. He was filling notebooks with stories, even finished a whole novel at 14, Goats von Berlichingen.
Wow.
And it had this crazy violent ending.
That's interesting.
Yeah, almost like it foreshadowed some of the darker stuff he'd explore later on in his philosophy. The teenage angst fueled the philosophy, maybe?
It makes you think, right? That self-belief, maybe it was a way of dealing with not having a dad around. And the novel, with all the rebellion and violence, it definitely hints at those existentialist themes he'd become known for. Freedom, responsibility, the dark side of human nature.
And let's not forget the physical challenges. He got glaucoma and strabismus, ended up cross-eyed, with bad vision in one eye.
Oh, wow, that's tough, especially as a kid.
Yeah, and the material suggests that it made him feel like an outsider at school. But that also pushed him to be more self-reliant.
Makes sense. It probably made him see himself as different. Not fitting in can make you think more, rely more on yourself. Maybe that pushed him towards philosophy, that focus on individual consciousness.
Then comes his time at the École Normale Supérieure, the big intellectual hub. And the people he was with, wow, future stars like Raymond Aron, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Simone Weil, and of course, Simone de Beauvoir.
Talk about a brain trust.
It must have been so stimulating.
It was the place to be in France if you were an intellectual. All these brilliant minds clashing, debating, shaping the thought of the 20th century, and Sartre was right there in the thick of it.
And that's where his relationship with Simone de Beauvoir began, a famously complicated one. The material gets into their intellectual partnership and their open relationship, which was pretty unconventional, even for the time.
Right.
They had this 2-year contract thing going on, and they tried to justify it philosophically using Kant's ideas about necessary and contingent truths.
Yeah, interesting approach.
And then there's this idea of transparency in their relationship, which sounds good in theory, but maybe trickier in real life. They were basically saying their main bond was necessary, like essential, and other relationships were contingent, more like circumstantial. It seems like they were using Kant to create a framework that allowed for both deep commitment and individual freedom.
Their relationship really was something else. The 2-year contract and that whole necessary versus contingent distinction, it was their way of reconciling their commitment with their belief in freedom, rejecting those traditional ideas of marriage.
Right.
And transparency, being totally open with each other, that was the ideal. But yeah, the material suggests it wasn't always easy. Emotions and desires can complicate things. But their intellectual partnership, that was undeniable, really shaped both of their work.
Okay, now to the philosophical heavy hitters who influenced Sartre. The sources point to Raymond Aron introducing him to Husserl's phenomenology. And this seems like a big turning point for Sartre. It gave him a framework that was all about individual experience and how we engage with the world.
Yeah, phenomenology, that was a big one for him.
Right. It moved him away from the more abstract stuff he'd been doing.
Exactly. Husserl was all about describing consciousness, like really carefully, and how we experience the world directly. That clicked with Sartre. It grounded his philosophy in lived experience, not abstract systems. The focus on subjective experience and intentionality, the idea that consciousness is always directed at something. Those became cornerstones of Sartre's existentialism.
And then there's Kierkegaard.
Ah, yes, Kierkegaard.
Oh, yes. The sources highlight how he emphasized the existing individual and this idea that there's an irrational element to existence. The first thing to understand is that we cannot understand everything. So good.
I love that quote.
His concept of subjectivity being truth and that anxiety we feel because we're so free.
Right, right.
Those seem like they really paved the way for Sartre's ideas.
Absolutely. Kierkegaard was all about individual experience, the weight of choice, and the anxiety that comes with freedom in a meaningless world. And he rejected purely rational philosophy, focusing on faith, doubt, despair, all those messy human things. That was huge for existentialism as a whole. And we should mention, too, that Husserl's project was about bridging the gap between rationalism and empiricism.
Through phenomenology.
Yeah, analyzing experience directly. So all of that was swirling around as Sartre was developing his ideas.
So with all that in mind, let's look at Sartre's core ideas, especially from his early work like Nausea.
Nausea, one of the greats.
There's this powerful idea of contingency. The realization that nothing, not even our own existence, is truly necessary.
Heavy stuff.
Like Roquentin and the chestnut tree root.
Yeah.
That image, it leads into this feeling of nausea, and the world just seems absurd.
Right. So powerful. Contingency is at the very heart of Sartre's existentialism. The chestnut tree root, it's like this symbol of pure existence, stripped bare, no reason for it, no purpose. And the nausea, that's the feeling of facing that raw truth.
And then that leads to seeing the world as absurd, right? Because it has no inherent meaning or order.
Exactly.
And from this, Sartre concludes, man is what he is in the present moment, and only there is he. We can't step outside of our own lives to find some objective view.
We're always in the process of becoming, shaped by what we do right now. No set path, no blueprint.
We're making ourselves as we go.
Exactly. And trying to find some ultimate meaning while we're still living, it's pointless. Our lives are defined by what we do, not by some future reflection or pre-existing plan.
The sources touch on Sartre's views on emotions and imagination, too. He seemed to think emotions were a way of avoiding the reality of existence.
Interesting.
Like self-deception or escapism.
Yeah, he saw emotions as a way to dodge the anxiety that comes with freedom. We create this magical world where feelings rule. Instead of facing the responsibility of choice in a meaningless universe and imagination, that's projecting ourselves into possibilities that don't even exist yet.
Trying to escape the present moment.
Exactly.
All right, now to being and nothingness.
The big one.
It lays out this core dichotomy, consciousness, which he equates with nothingness, le néant, versus being, or thingness, l'être.
Okay.
And he says consciousness is empty because the whole world is outside of it.
This is the heart of his ontology.
Ontology, right.
Being in itself, en soi, that's the realm of stuff. Just existing, solid, no awareness, no change in its being. Being for itself, pour soi, that's consciousness.
Okay.
And it's defined by not having a fixed being.
Nothingness.
Yeah, it's not a thing, but a process. Always aware, questioning, negating the being in itself. And because consciousness is always focused on something other than itself, the world, other people, it's empty of its own preset content. Its very nature is to be in relation to what it's not.
So this for itself, it's free, undetermined. It chooses itself through desire and action.
And that leads us to radical freedom and the huge responsibility that comes with it.
Even to the point of feeling responsible for World War II, that's a lot to carry.
It is.
Yeah.
But for Sartre, we're so free, meaning there's no set values, no human nature telling us what to do. So we're completely responsible for our choices and therefore for the kind of world we create. Even when it feels like we have no choice, how we react is still a choice. We're responsible. The World War II thing, yeah, it's extreme.
Right.
But it shows how far this responsibility goes. Even doing nothing, accepting things as they are, that's a choice. It shapes the world.
And without God, without inherent meaning, everything we do seems kind of pointless in the grand scheme of things.
That's the tough part of atheistic existentialism.
Yeah.
No higher power, no purpose. So yeah, everything we do is temporary. It won't matter in the end to the universe. This awareness of absurdity, it's all over his work.
Now to ethics.
Yeah.
The sources talk about mauvaise foi, bad faith, or self-deception.
Yeah, mauvaise foi.
It's when We try to force meaning onto our existence to avoid that burden of freedom, like blindly accepting social values or religious beliefs.
It's denying our freedom by clinging to external stuff, like roles, essences, whatever. We lie to ourselves about our own agency. We avoid the anxiety of creating our own meaning. For Sartre, the key is existence precedes essence. We're born blank slates. We define ourselves through what we do.
No preset human nature.
Right.
Finally, the outline mentions how Sartre became more involved in social and political stuff later on.
Yeah, his focus shifted.
His views on Marxism evolved too. Eventually, he became this huge intellectual figure.
Even won the Nobel Prize.
Which he refused. It's like he went from this deep dive into individual consciousness to grappling with the bigger social and political realities. We should probably spend a bit more time on his relationship with Marxism.
Yeah, it'd be good to flesh that out a bit.
Yeah.
Was it a full-on conversion? What did he critique or change?
Right.
But yeah, his early work was all about the individual. Later on, he wanted to connect existentialism to social issues, power structures, justice, liberation. And his rejection of the Nobel Prize, that was so him, anti-establishment to the end. But even with these shifts, the core themes stayed the same. Freedom, responsibility, the contingency of life. That's his legacy.
Okay, to sum up our Sartre deep dive, we explored this counterintuitive idea. Consciousness is empty, defined by its outward focus. We tackled radical freedom and the responsibility that comes with it.
Huge responsibility.
We wrestled with contingency, the absurdity of existence in a meaningless world.
Right.
And we looked at mauvaise foi, how we trick ourselves to avoid facing these truths.
Classic Sartre.
We also traced his journey, how his philosophy went from the individual to the social and political.
A fascinating trajectory.
So, thinking about Sartre's idea, the world is outside consciousness. What sticks with you? You know, as you're bombarded with information every day, trying to figure out where you fit in, does this idea of consciousness being open, directed outward, change how you think about your own awareness, your relationship with the world?
It's a big question. It makes you rethink things. We often feel like our inner world is the real one, right? Thoughts, feelings, memories. But Sartre is saying, no, it's the connection to the outside that matters.
It flips the script. And thinking about all the stuff we covered today, this radical freedom, that responsibility, does it feel liberating or kind of terrifying when you really think about the weight of those choices?
It's both, isn't it? The excitement of creating your own life, but the pressure of knowing it's all on you.
Sartre famously said, "Man is condemned to be free." So is that a burden or an opportunity, especially for you, the learner, as you're taking in new knowledge, shaping your own understanding? What does it even mean to be condemned, to define yourself through your actions, your choices, in a world without inherent meaning? It's something to think about as you explore these ideas further, in your sources and beyond.
That's what it's all about.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.